Hello and welcome at Book Lovers Companion. My name is Edith and right next to me is my lovely co-host, the Chattering Teacup.
Hello.
And here with us from across the pond, Caroline Ailanthus. And we are going to talk about your book, Ecological Memory, which, correct me if I'm wrong, came out in 2019 already.
Yes, that's correct.
Just before a certain event.
Yes.
And yet...
It worked out that way.
Yeah. Interesting, because right after that, as we all know, 2020, a pandemic did hit. And a pandemic features in your book. Tell us about your book. Why did you start writing about this event? When did you come up with the idea?
Well, the pandemic in the book that's not the subject of the book. That's the thing I needed to write about in order to make the subject happen.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's this fairly common literary / entertainment trope, like you see it in movies and stuff too, where there's this end of the world and then after that comes something else. Usually it's a dystopia. Mine is not a dystopia. It's not bad. But even the dystopia stories, I mean, they're sort of secretly wishful thinking most of the time, you know, like civilization falls and then everybody is running around the desert in cool outfits and, you know, swashbuckling and, you know, whatever. So I thought, well, okay, I can see the appeal of this trope, but wishful thinking that involves, you know, lots of people dying is, you know, kind of questionable. So I decided I wanted to explore kind of a more honest version of that trope. Okay, what happens if civilization falls? The thing that comes next is actually kind of pretty cool. You know, it's sort of like best case scenario as long as it's believable. But what's that like? What would that be like to survive the loss of everything? And have to put your life back together. So I wrote this book. This is one thing that writers do. You know, we have questions and we answer them by writing books. Anyway, so I needed something to end civilization. And, you know, a pandemic seemed plausible, you know.
Yeah, it did. Maybe not at that point, but now we know.
I mean, it was plausible at this point. The pandemic, COVID-19 took people by surprise who, no offense to anyone, weren't paying attention. I mean, you know, you were paying attention to everything else, you know, your lives, you have to go shopping and pick up the, you know, whatever. But people who pay attention to things like that for a living, they knew sooner or later that was going to happen. And the scary thing is the fact that it's happened already doesn't mean it's not going to happen again. There could be another pandemic like this, you know, next week. It's just something that we're vulnerable to, and that vulnerability is well known, so I used it for the book.
Like you said, it's not the main plot in the book. The main plot is what came afterwards. And you mentioned in the preface of your book, it's a post-apocalyptic optimism. It's not a dystopian novel, which it isn't, actually. And your two main characters, Elsie and Andy, they travel... Or they travel more or less through the United States or part of the United States, and we get a glimpse or glimpses of the past and what happened after the pandemic. I mean, for me, it was that Elsie was looking for her past, which she can't really remember, whereas Andy, on the other hand, wants to forget or doesn't want to dwell on the past, but he can be convinced by Elsie to talk about what happened or to tell her what happened, what was going on. And it's very personal for him, what happened. So tell us about those characters a little bit more. Who is Elsie, who is Andy, and who gave you the idea for those characters?
That's interesting because I have two main ways of developing characters. And each of them is an example of one way. Like they developed in opposite ways from a creative perspective. So that's interesting to. Elsie will be. I don't know. Books set in the future do odd things to verb tenses. Elsie was a child when civilization collapsed. So she doesn't remember how things used to be. She doesn't really know what happened. Her memory from her childhood isn't good. It's not like a dramatic amnesia thing exactly. But yeah, she was just really little and a lot of stuff happened and she just doesn't remember it. She's a young adult in the now of the story. She's a young adult. She's 26. She is by training, she's a former vigilante. There was, in this backstory, there was a period of time that was sort of like, the cool people in clothes in the desert. It just didn't last very long. So she was a vigilante when she was a teenager. And then as society got more organized again, she became a cop. But she's actually a science geek. Science is her first and primary love. So she's now retraining to be an environmental educator. And Andy is... The way education works has changed a little bit. That's explained in the story. But in our terms, he's kind of like her thesis advisor, something like that. He's her professor, her mentor, and he's an ecologist. And what they're doing is every year he takes a semester or two off to travel around the country and lecture, give workshops, network, that sort of thing. So he's taking her with him, and she's doing her environmental education thing under his supervision. He's a mysterious person. He won't talk about himself. He doesn't like talking about himself. He's very much an outside of the box thinker. He zigs when other people zags. And he's kind of reserved. And Elsie just hero worships him, which he puts up with.
More or less, yes.
And one of the things you find out very early in the story is that he lost 2 children in the collapse. Yeah. His son vanished. His daughter died. And if his daughter were still alive, she'd be Elsie's age. Yeah. So when Elsie asks him to start, tell her about the past, he feels like he can't say no because it's his daughter asking. And so he ends up in this position, like he's telling her this personal stuff that he doesn't want to talk about. And, so it kind of goes from there. And, and there's a major piece that I'm leaving out. I'll add it back in on another question.
but there's also this important question from Elsie, not just about his past, but how humanity more or less organized life again. How do we organize ourselves? How do we organize?
Recreate society.
Yeah, recreate society. And how do we live as humans again in groups without, like you mentioned, there is no central government anymore. So we had to organize ourselves. We had to come together. We had to trade. We had to form sorts of councils.
Yeah, and I think even though it's set in the future and has modern technology in some regards, it also has elements of the past.
Oh, yeah.
Well, it has elements of what works, is the thing. One of the things that I've decided is that in this future, there's no more fossil fuel use. It's kind of like one of those things, like if you're addicted to cigarettes and you have to go in the hospital and you without cigarettes for a couple of months, when you're in the hospital. When you get out, do you go back to that addiction and start smoking cigarettes again, or do you take advantage of the bad? So they don't go back to fossil fuel. So some of the technologies and so forth that they're using are things that were used in the past, like ox carts and things like that.
Yeah.
But it's not that they've gone backwards. It's that they're using the technologies available to them in ways that make sense given their situation. And in some ways, their technology is more advanced than ours. There's one character who's paraplegic and has a robotic exoskeleton that works so well. It's under her clothes. You can't tell she's paraplegic.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's what I've also found interesting. But oh, well, that's quite, from my point of view, as I'm not a scientist myself, quite futuristic. And like I said, it's in the future, but still, on the one hand, you have this oxen carts, and then you have a person using an exoskeleton.
But it's,
Yes.
I think, a good combination of, as you said, using things that work, because not everything that was here in the past is something bad.
Oh.
So if it's good, just keep it.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And you also have, that's another thing I found interesting, what you use from the past, more or less. I mean, maybe we are more familiar with it. I don't know. Guilds, for example. Because that's how in the past here in Europe professions were organized. Because you had to be part of a guild, and then you had to represent this guild all the way through your life. I mean, members of guilds, they had even during religious ceremonies, you knew exactly who belonged to which guild, because the place they had during, I don't know, in church or something else. And they dressed in a certain way. And I get from your book that, again, people dress in a certain way and they are recognizable to be part of this group or that group.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, there are in-story explanations for how the guild system evolved. And some of them are in the book. Some of it's explored a little bit more in the sequels. There's a sequel coming.
Oh, okay.
How that happened. But I mean, I don't know very much about how historical guilds operated. I know that they existed and to some extent still exist. I don't know very much about that, but I read a book a while ago that was explaining that in Indo-European culture, so, all of the different modern cultures that grew out of that, one of the sort of common elements is the idea of the division of society into three different groups, farmers, educated people, generally priests, lawyers, doctors, that sort of thing, and the military. And I read that and I started thinking, well, yes, America does that. We don't know that we do that because we don't talk about it. It's not overt. But, educated people, there are these educated professions that have similar structures under certain circumstances. They do dress alike. They call outside people who aren't in the group lay people.
Yeah.
And they all use that word, lay people, whether you're a priest or a scientist. So, and then, the military, of course, they refer to everybody else as civilians. So I was just really interested in this idea. Well, okay. Wouldn't it be fun to make this more overt again and to play with this? So I developed this idea of this
like I said,
futuristic guild system.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, it's not that unfamiliar to us here in Europe because we had it for a long time, actually. And like you said, this division of society into certain groups, again, something we absolutely can relate to because of the past, not just the past, because it was still there a long time, wasn't it, Teacup? Even at the beginning of the 20th century.
Yeah, but I think it's innate. It seems in humans that in one way they want to band together.
Yeah.
But within this group, they want to divide people.
Yeah.
I don't know why, but it seems that way. And then it happens today along different lines. But
diversity more manageable, and in all sorts of ways. Specific like social roles. And to be clear, in my book, you're not born into these. Everybody starts out, farmer class, and then you can join the military or go to college or whatever it is. But, if you, even in a relatively small community, a few hundred people, everybody's doing different things. There's a lot of detail to keep track of.
Yeah.
So if you be, okay, all you people, you're doing something kind of similar. So you're in a group. And you people, you're in a group too. You're doing something kind of similar. So each of you dresses differently and, has different ways of acting. Then, okay, now I have 3 things to keep track of instead of 500 things to keep track of. That makes my life easier.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That has a lot to do with it.
And everyone being born the same and having the same chances is part of the optimism in your book.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that happens in my book, and I think this is actually plausible. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's inevitable, but I think it's plausible and maybe likely that if civilization ends, the survivors will at least temporarily be equal. You know, there'll be no money. That means there are no rich people or poor people. There's no, it's just, do you have something to eat or don't you?
Yeah.
And that's kind of part of the creative game that writing the book is. Like, okay, the world, this civilization, the world as we know it ends, and the thing that comes after is better. Like lots of things that I don't like are just gone. Lots of things that I do like are there in force, and there's more of them. That's great. And can I take this daydream and avoid treating people as mere collateral damage in service to that daydream? If I'm going to imagine a circumstance where there's all this suffering in order to get to this wonderful world that I want, how can I not ignore that suffering? How can I be honest enough to face that?
Yeah.
And I want to be clear. I don't want listeners to think that this is some kind of doom and gloom thing and like everything's horrible. And it's not. There are some passages that deal with pain and suffering, but overall, it's an upbeat book.
It is. It actually is, because, like you said at the beginning, it's about optimism, and you feel it. It's not, like you said, it's not doom and gloom. It's not The Walking Dead, where everything is grey or even dark grey.
The pictures you see aren't dark.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. Because there's a lot going on, and the people they meet, not everyone is positive. Don't get me wrong. You have this scene where something bad happens and they have to deal with it. But overall, you get the impression that the people they meet, they are positive. Or they try to step forward from what they have experienced through this whole thing. But you do mention, which I also found interesting in the book, is those enclaves where people don't organize in a democratic way, but rather in a kind of dictatorship, be it of the religious kind or the not so religious kind.
But it's also human.
It's also human, exactly.
Yeah, my characters never enter one of those enclaves. It is mentioned that they exist. That this isn't a world where everybody has found the same solution to the same problem and everybody's on the same page. There are definitely people who are doing their own thing, and it's not always, their own thing isn't always savory. That is mentioned.
And it's very likely, isn't it? I mean, come to think of how some groups act today, it's very likely that might happen in a situation like that.
Yes. I regard everything that happens in this book as possible and most of it as likely. That's why I wrote it that way. People are free to disagree with me. You're free to say, oh, that wouldn't happen. But
yeah, but I think it's very realistic that there are different answers to the same situation and how to cope with it. And I think it's also optimistic in a way that people survive it all. Because nowadays, sometimes you have these doomsayers where you think, okay, everything is gone. But it continues in one way or another.
Yeah. This is a world in which there has been 90% mortality. Not from the pandemic itself, but from basically everybody got sick at the same time. And as we saw in our real pandemic, when people stop going to work for whatever reason, bad stuff starts happening. So if everybody stops going to work, basically, if some things, if you turn them off, you can't turn them back on again.
Mm-hmm.
And civilization ends up being one of those things. So there's this massive die-off that happens, and I can't remember why I started talking. I lost my train of thought. Oh no.
No, don't worry. You will find it again. But may I ask you, like we said, you wrote this book and it came out in 2019. Then 2020 happened. I mean, in your mind, what was your thought when you realized, oh, it's happening? And did you think, oh, let's sit back and see what is going to happen?
Or did you think, why now?
There was a definite aspect of, okay, this is interesting. Let's watch this. And, of course, okay, where's my mask? How do I go shopping? I hope nobody I care about gets sick. Oh no, people I care about are getting sick. Are they going to die? I don't mean that I was completely detached from the whole thing, but yeah, there was an element of, oh, cool, let's watch what happens. One thing that happened, I did a lot of research to support this book. So I put a lot of thought into taking what I had learned and coming up with a scenario that was plausible. Like, what would a pandemic have to be like in order to actually crash civilization, globally? And it was pretty obvious from the beginning that COVID-19 wasn't going to do that. There were a few places where I was worried when we started having supply chain problems. Then I got worried and started having conversations like, okay, who do I know who's a farmer? But you'd think that having written a book like this when COVID-19 happened, I would go like, oh, my book is coming true. But what actually happened was, oh, okay, because I wrote this book, I know that we're probably going to be okay.
Yeah. I mean, like you said, your thought, who do I know who is a farmer? We spoke about other events that were changing or when we realized what we did would not sustain us. For example, when we spoke about World War II, for example, here in Europe or here in Vienna, especially. So, for example, my father, he was a boy when the war ended and he was about 5-6 years old. And he always said, I was never hungry because he lived in the countryside. My grandmother was a farmer, like you said. She had animals, they had plants, they had a garden. Everything was okay. In Vienna, on the other hand, people were starving. People sold their gold. People gave their gold to farmers who took a lot from them because for a little bit of food. And they turned the parks into gardens here in Vienna, which wasn't enough, of course. And when we look at what is happening now, for example, the building block of flats without end, it seems. They are not stopping. And they're using land.
Very fertile ground.
Fertile ground,
for farming
yes.
Before.
Because there were farms on this ground only a few years back. And you think, why? I mean, this is criminal. Why are they doing this?
Even with the supply chain problems you mentioned before, nothing has changed in the end.
No.
Yeah, we're vulnerable, and a lot of the people writing world-ending stories, and I didn't realize that there are as many of them as there are when I wrote this book. It was like, oh wow, everybody's writing one. But a lot of these stories, if somebody writes a story about a virus that kills off, then it's a virus that kills lots of people. Or, if there's nuclear, or whatever. These stories are not paying attention to the much bigger threat, which is that our supply chains are too long, too vulnerable. And if those lines get cut, billions of people will starve to death. That's the chance of a virus actually sickening enough people to shut down civilization is really small. a lot of things would have to go wrong, one after the other. And if even one of those things doesn't go wrong, it kind of stops the domino effect and and all the other things that could take us out are also actually really unlikely. I mean, we need to keep our eyes open. We need to handle these risks, but they're low risks. But the chance that something could happen that will cut those supply chains long enough to notice, that's not low. That's you want to stay up at night worrying about something. Stay up at night worrying about that, or stay up at night worrying about climate change. I mean, that's really going to do us in as well. These are popular culture is not paying attention to the right threats. We're worried about the wrong things, and I'd like to help correct that in my own small way.
Do you think also the question of how to keep up order is a threat? I mean, in your book, you write, after the pandemic, people got sick. It was not just the virus. What happened during that? People started to riot. People started to loot. But there wasn't enough, support for people to help avoid that. For example, like you said, police officers. There weren't enough police officers. There weren't enough firefighters when buildings and so on were burning. That also played, or maybe even the bigger part in bringing down society.
Yeah. You get into a chain reaction sort of thing. I mean, there are certain ways in which society acts like an organism. So when a civilization dies, it can be like when a person dies. 2019 was very difficult for my family. My husband and I each lost a sibling to cancer at the same time. So, I watched this process, and with both of them, the last few months, there was this process of one thing goes wrong, and then that makes another thing go wrong. And the doctors come and fix this, but then this other thing is going wrong. And it's just this cascade. The body loses its ability to stop this cascade. And the book was already substantially written by then. There were times in that really horrible process where I did have moments of perspective and distance where I would think, oh, I got it right in the book. This is how it works. But yeah, I mean, a society can die the way people do. It's not just one thing. It's one thing that causes another thing that causes another thing that causes another thing. It's because the systems that keep those dominoes from falling are out of commission. And once those go,
everything collapses.
Yeah. Yeah. Once those go, you're terminal.
Well, I think it can happen very quickly.
Yeah.
If the first, say, domino falls.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think there's a difference between countries? How fast it might happen?
Probably. Now, this is embarrassing to admit, but I know relatively little about the rest of the world. I'm probably not quite as bad as many other Americans. I know my own country best. I'm not really a global citizen. So I don't know how. My book stipulates that civilization crashed globally. Exactly how it crashed in Austria, I don't know. I haven't figured. And maybe you can figure that out and let me know. That would be cool. But my understanding is that countries do vary in their dependence on global supply chains. The United States is extremely vulnerable. There have been calculations made that, like in New England, the region where my book is set, there's only a couple of major roads that go into New England. From a transportation perspective, it's an island. And somebody I don't remember the number of days, but it was something like 27 or so. It was a small number of days where if those roads were cut and you couldn't get food into New England from somewhere else, there would be starvation conditions in a couple of weeks. Now, there are countries that are not so much like that because there's a much higher proportion of subsistence farmers. Here, most farmers aren't subsistence farmers. My husband's best friend is a farmer, and he grows corn and soybeans, and he sells those corn and soybeans to companies that raise chickens. So he's growing chicken feed is what he's doing. And so he sells his crop, he gets his money, and he goes to the store to buy his food just like a city person would. If those stores don't have money in them, it don't have food in them, he's going to starve just like somebody living in the middle of New York City would.
Mm.
And not all countries are like that. There are countries where, my understanding anyway, I mean, I could be wrong, but where a much greater proportion of farmers are eating their own food and storing their own food from harvest to harvest. And, if the system collapses, they're much more likely to survive. Yeah, as long as somebody doesn't go push them off their land or something, which could happen. So that's a variability that could be quite. Another source of variability is how countries handle stress. Yeah, I think that the United States would have a tendency to riot and turn on each other. Andy, at one point, he's telling Elsie about the pandemic, and he's talking about how people just started making up, because nobody understood where the pandemic came from. And they started making up explanations and, things like undocumented Mexican immigrants smuggled into the thing and all kinds of craziness. And I think my country would probably, not that everybody would go nuts that way, but enough people would, it could cause a serious problem. Are there countries that don't have those kinds of divisions? Probably. My country also has, these industrial things that could go wrong in a very serious way. Writing this book, I actually emailed the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and said, okay, I'm right. This is one of the great things about being a writer, by the way. You can email anybody and say, I'm a writer, I have questions, and they'll probably answer them. It's amazing. They take you seriously. So I emailed the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and it turns out they do have people whose job is to answer questions like this. They want their work to be understood. They want the public to know what nuclear power is and is not about. So they have people who do this sort of thing. So I said, okay, I have this scenario in my book. If this happened, would it be possible to do a cold shutdown before complete collapse? And he said it would. And I just breathed a sigh of relief because that meant that I didn't have to include nuclear accidents in my story. But that is presupposing that people see the writing on the wall quickly enough to initiate the cold shutdowns and so forth. I think they might, but there may also be countries where there isn't the willingness to behave responsibly in that way, or where for some reason the cold shutdown process takes longer, or that might vary as well. So there might be some countries that have major industrial accidents, complicating the situation. So that could vary.
Yeah. You also mentioned not just the plants, but also the weapons were disabled. So I don't think that might be able in other countries that quickly, for example, like you said, because the infrastructure is not there, probably.
Yeah. In my story, it's briefly mentioned that somebody disabled the nuclear arsenal, and it's not known who. The government ordered the cold shutdown of the nuclear power plants and equivalent shutdowns of chemical plants and that sort of thing. But nobody ordered I can't imagine anybody making that order to permanently disable the arsenal. That doesn't seem plausible. But what does seem plausible to me is that the actual workers on those sites would say, okay, we gotta do this. And Andy mentions that although he doesn't know the details, he doesn't know who, that there were people who stayed at work doing that and never saw their families again. That was one of the kinds of sacrifices that certain people quietly and anonymously made for the world.
Mm-hmm.
And writing a story in these extreme circumstances puts the characters under extreme stress. And
Yes.
how is it exploring these characters in these situations compared to, let's say, a regular novel set in normal times?
Well, for one thing, I don't write novels set in normal times. It's a pattern that I developed without realizing it, and then sort of after the fact, I was like, wait, the thing is, I don't really pay much attention to pop culture.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I don't know who the latest musicians are, and I can't use slang. If I try, I'll end up sounding like someone from the 1980s. And all of that would be a real problem if I were going to write a story set in my own culture. For me, it would be like writing a story set in a foreign country that I just actually don't visit. And all of my readers would be in a perfect position to notice every little small mistake that I made. So, no. But if I make up a setting, then, I can't really get it wrong. So there's that.
Especially if it's in the future.
Yep.
But certainly I could write stories that are less fraught. Not to do that either. I tend to write books about really good people who have really terrible things happen to them. I mean, if you ever find out that you are a character in a Caroline Ailanthus book, you better hope you're not the main character. I mean, seriously.
Oh, I wouldn't mind to be a character in your book.
People so much, so it's really hard. And but I mean, that wasn't Andy particularly. Elsie goes through a lot, but she was a child at the time, so she was kind of insulated from a lot of it, and that was so she's not so obviously traumatized, but Andy is, and so what I did. He's based on a amalgam of real people, one of whom is me. And there are certain things that happen in my mind when I'm under a lot of stress.
Mm-hmm.
So I exaggerated them and came up with Andy's stress reaction and what active trauma does to him. And then I mixed in a few other things that just sort of sounded useful, like the part where he's in the woods and he keeps hearing sirens in the distance. And then when he stops walking to kind of focus on them and listen, he can't hear them. And he starts walking again and then the sirens start up again. That happened to me. I don't think it was a trauma reaction.
Mm-hmm.
I was walking I was hiking in the Maine woods, and that happened. Like when I was walking, I could hear distant sirens. And I've never found out what that was.
Mm-hmm.
Whether I was imagining it or hallucinating or there actually were sirens. And I have no idea.
Mm-hmm.
But it fit with what else was going on with him.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And my question also would be for Andy, because I mentioned before there was a certain scene I'm not going to mention because I don't want to give anything away. But my question would be, what would it take for good people to do bad things?
I'm curious now which scene you have in mind.
Where they talk about this, where they meet this man, and Elsie has to take very drastic measures.
Ah, yes. I know the scene you mean. I try and stay away from judging my characters as good or bad.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't so much happen in this book, but in my previous book, which I don't want to distract us by talking about too much. I have written 2 books, but in my previous book, I deliberately played with that, and I set up characters to be protagonists and look like good guys, and then had them do very, very bad things to sort of mess with the reader. I'm not playing those games here, but I don't believe in good guys and bad guys.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I mentioned Andy is based on multiple real people. One of them he's partially based on me, and I like to think that I'm a good person. I try very hard to be a good person. One of the other models for the character is someone I admire very much, and he is, as far as I can tell, an excellent person. And he's probably close to being a genuinely good person, and he certainly tries to be. And he would not have taken those drastic measures in that scene himself.
Mm-hmm.
He wouldn't have done it, but he let Elsie do it. She tries to be a good person, but I'm not sure that she is. She's just a person, and she does what she needs to do. She used to be a vigilante, and she's definitely willing to make the hard choices and do what needs to be done. So what makes a good person do bad things? Lots of things. I suspect what happens most of the time is that they think the bad thing is a good thing, so they do it.
Or maybe the less evil. Maybe the less evil of two options.
Yeah, the less evil or the less personal. I think a lot of people are really willing, when faced with a choice between seeing somebody they know and care about hurt versus seeing people they don't know and don't care about hurt. They'll hurt strangers. Yeah, that's very common.
Yeah,
it ties into the
question, and they'll go on thinking they're good people.
Yeah,
I think it ties into the question: what are you willing to do to save your family or friends?
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, and that's something that Andy struggles with. He talks about how when the collapse happened, he had friends who were ranchers in the Southwest, and he went to live with them, and they developed this like subsistence ranch, and they had a problem with people trying to come in and steal their cattle. And somebody steals your food source, then you're going to die.
Yeah.
So the group had a security force, and they would go out and take care of the problem. And Andy he was not on the security force. He never, he explains that he did used to carry a gun, but then when an emergency happened, he forgot he had the weapon. So because he's just fundamentally not willing to use violence. And by the way, that happens. I was in a situation many years ago where I had a weapon on hand and was physically threatened, and I forgot I had the weapon. I never, I talked my way out of the situation. But if you're being armed doesn't mean that you're going to use your weapon.
Exactly, and it doesn't also not mean you might survive the situation. Maybe in your case, it was the better solution to talk your way out of it.
Probably. I mean, I didn't have weapon training. I wouldn't have been good at it. But Andy is haunted by the fact that he benefited from other people being violent. That haunts him.
Mm-hmm.
That he allowed people to kill on his behalf. 20 years later, he's still haunted by that.
Yeah, I can imagine that. Not being able yourself, but like you said, letting other people do the bad deed, so to speak, for your survival.
Either way, you're not able to forget it.
Yeah.
Caroline, there's a lot in this book, and it is a fantastic read. And again, thank you for the optimism in this book, unlike so many other books that deal with post-apocalyptic topics. And after having written 2 books already, what is your advice for any other aspiring author out there?
Well, I usually say that my advice is to ask specific questions. Yeah, it's very rare for there to be a piece of blanket advice that will apply to everybody. It's much more helpful to try and write, and then when you get stuck, find somebody and ask, "Hey, help! I'm stuck. How do I get out of this?" But if you want to take the role of one of those aspiring writers and ask a more specific question, then I'll do my best to answer that. That might be more interesting.
Okay. And can you elaborate a little bit on your upcoming plans? What is next?
Well, most immediately is the sequel to Ecological Memory. It's called Bifurcation Events. this is these books are part of a series, and I'm deliberately using scientific terms as titles because the books are about scientists. You don't need to be a scientist to read these things. You just need to be a geek. You don't need to be a geek, but it helps. Geek friendly. Let's put it that way. You need to be geek friendly. You need to like geeks. But yeah, the next one, it's actually a collection of stories, some of them short, some of them longer. And we do get to find out about what Andy and Elsie do next. We also get to find out a little bit more about what they were doing before. One of the first stories in the book is of Elsie as a 6-year-old girl. So you get to do that. But, I have all of these plate spinning. Andy says that he never could do just one thing at once. And that's me. I can't do just one thing at once. I need to have all the plates spinning all at once. So I'm in the process of pitching my first nonfiction book. So fingers crossed that happens. I just got a new idea for a novel that's going to be in the high fantasy genre, which I've never tackled before, and is swirling together stuff from the Roman Empire and from the American Civil War. And I'm seriously considering using Billy Joel song titles as chapter titles. Crazy stuff. So I've got a lot of plate spinning. Bifurcation Events is next up, but I've got a lot of things going on.
Sounds like that, absolutely. And Caroline, is there anything else you would like our listeners to know?
Let's see. Okay, well, I guess it's worth saying I'm the only Caroline Ailanthus in the world, as far as I can tell. I Google myself and I'm the only one who comes up. So that means that if you want to find my books, the search term you're going to use is my name. Don't try and you don't have to remember the titles of the books. Look for my name. Then you'll find my books. Much easier. Also, at the beginning, I said that I'd left out something important and would stick it back in somewhere. So this is, I guess, the time to do it. The main plot of Ecological Memory is a detective story. I mean, there's no crime. It's not that kind of detective story. But there is a puzzle that Andy and Elsie are trying to solve together. So, if you like post-apocalyptic, optimistic travelogues, and you like puzzles and mysteries and detective stories, and I got it all.
True, absolutely true. I can agree to that. It's worth your while, dear readers. Take it up, read it. And like I said, the optimistic part is nice. Again, after all this doom and gloom we had on TV and in books, it's nice to have a more utopian, a tiny bit utopian.
More upbeat take on the future.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I watch the news, I get depressed, I go to my laptop and I write optimistic stories. This is how I get through the day. It really is.
Yeah, exactly. Take up a book that is more upbeat. If you're not a writer, that is.
I think sometimes if people think that the future is all, our civilization as we know it is going to end one way or another. That's what unsustainable means. That's just what's going to happen. Yeah. And I think maybe what's going on is that a lot of people, they're not taking steps to make the changes that we need to make because they think that the future is going to be horrible. I'm very disturbed by the fact that, the post-apocalyptic stories are so universally dystopian. Like, what is wrong with us that we can't imagine a good future? Maybe if people can be helped to believe that the next thing that comes after this is going to be good, maybe they'll be more assertive about making it that way. And then we can have a good future.
Yeah.
So, in my own modest way, or not modest as the case might be. Yeah, I hope to be able to do something about that.
Yeah, so do we. More like you. We need them. So, Caroline, thank you for joining us. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks for having me.
You did enjoy this episode as much as we did? Then hit subscribe and don't miss the next episode. Also, make sure to follow us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. If you like to support us and buy us a coffee, you can do so via Buy Me a Coffee and other platforms. You can find all the necessary links in the description. Until next time.